I think one of the most interesting things that has happened in recent weeks, as I've been talking about gratitude to different groups of people, is I presented these alternatives: the structure of scarcity, the idea of debt and duty, and then the biblical idea, which is that of a table that is set by God in the wilderness, and it's a table of abundance. The food never ends; it never stops. The gifts never. They just never cease. And so many stories in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are about just that. The manna in the wilderness, God offering provision for the prophets when they are wandering the desert, caring for the people even when they're in exile. Lament and gratitude come together in the Psalms in a beautiful and amazing way. And then, of course, Jesus' stories of the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000. That's not about a miracle, about Jesus sort of snapping his fingers and having a bunch of fish show up. That is it's a story that illustrates that Jesus is a channel of God's fullest abundance. That even when you think there's not enough food, that you have 5,000 people to feed and you only have a few fishes and a loaf of bread, that nevertheless, there still really, truly are gifts. And that scarcity is not the reality of the universe, but rather in God's presence, abundance is always the reality. So I've been talking about that and preaching sermons on it. And actually, it's really changed the way that I understand my life and that I understand gratitude. Because I used to think that gratitude was simply a feeling. If somebody gave me something nice, well, I felt good about that because we all like getting gifts. But the truth of the matter is we are all given gifts all the time. Every single day that we are alive, there is a gift because we're alive. There's breath, there's water to drink, there's friendship to be had. We are conscious, we're in this beautiful, amazing world. We're surrounded by gifts. And even if you have the worst day possible, you have a gift because you're alive. And so that is it's a reality. We live in giftedness. And that does make us go, oh, that's amazing. And we feel something. But then those feelings call us into an ethic. They call us into action, into a way of life, into doing something. And so the next step is not just, I feel fantastic that I'm alive even on this really horrible day, and that I'm not dead, and that I can breathe, and that with any hope there'll be a day tomorrow. And so we have the feeling, but now the question is, well, what do I do about that?
So gratitude it's not a feeling, it's in relationship to something.
Right. It's always in relationship to something because we never feel grateful unless there's been a gift. And there's never a gift without a giver. And so
you can take a gift.
Well, actually, I talk about the idea of receiving communion, how we misunderstand communion when we talk about we take the bread and wine, but that the word is translated as receive, labete, which we translate as take in many churches, is actually it means to receive this gift. And so that whole idea that we are receivers is one of the most important things to understand about all of us as human beings, is that before we're anything else, we receive.
How so?
Well, if you were born, you've received a gift. It had absolutely nothing to do with you. You were gifted with that life. If you believe in God, if you're a theist, God has given you that life. If you are an atheist or a humanist, you believe that your parents' DNA has combined to give you that life. Some scientific process has given you that life.
The gift of just the whole miracle of creation and stars and molecules just to get to this point where I could be born.
That's right. The universe has gifted you with life. And so whether a theist or a mystical scientist or a humanist, the first thing that happens to any of us as human beings is something that none of us either take or control. And then, of course, because the way the human beings are, the way that we're made through the first years of our lives, that's primarily all gift as well. Because someone has to feed us, tend us, clean us, protect us, keep us from being ill, caring for us when we're sick. And if someone doesn't do that for you, you have nothing. And certainly people talk about sometimes that how their babies are the greatest gift they've ever received, and that's fair enough. We can talk about how children give us gifts even though they never really even intended. But the truth of the matter is that really our lives, for the first decade or so, can completely be seen as a series of gifts that are given to us by other people who honestly are under no obligation to care for us or really give us gifts. And so it's an amazing thing being a human in that way. So it just amazes me that American culture in particular has diminished that idea so greatly, so that we think, we're born and then we grow into these independent spirits and that we take what we need.
I mean, how do you win if you're receiving? You can't win through receiving.
And that's, of course, what no religious tradition teaches. No religious tradition teaches that winning is the
Christian country, I think we've been taught.
no religious tradition teaches us that winning is the point. Loving, is the point. And so we live in this universe where our lives are bathed in gifts from the very beginning, and we are, first of all, receivers. And when I was a little girl, of course, my mom always taught me it's better to give than to receive. But you can't give anything until you've received. And so that is really one of the false myths of American culture, is that there is such a thing as a pure benefactor, that there's someone who is a magic savior who's going to give us all the gifts that we deserve. And if we're just good enough, or if we will be loyal enough, or we work hard enough, the person with those gifts is going to pay attention to us, and they'll reward us. And then we will say thank you in return, and maybe do that person a favor because they have been our benefactor. And all of that is just basically ancient Rome brought up to contemporary America. And that's the very thing that Jesus was arguing against in the whole of the New Testament.
And what did it get him?
Well, it got him the fact that he's loved and revered and remembered as one of the most compassionate humans that ever lived. And pretty much everybody remembers Jesus' name, but there are very few people who even were Caesar, whose name people remember. If you are fairly literate, if you know something about science or literature, you might know Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar, or maybe Nero. But beyond that, I don't see too many people worshiping any of those people or remembering them fondly. But the truth of the matter is that Jesus, who set a table of gifts, and that's what the Thursday and Holy Week is all about, is Jesus is reminding his friends of God's abundance, of the freedom, the exodus that comes from abundance.
Say that again. Exodus comes from abundance?
Yeah.
Kind of so.
Well, at that table, those gifts, the Exodus, they're celebrating Passover. And Passover is truly a celebration of God's abundant gifts for everybody, where the people, the ancient Israelites, leave slavery, where Pharaoh has controlled every movement of their lives, all the food they've gotten, all the provision they have, who they could marry, whether or not they could keep their children. And so Pharaoh created for the slaves a universe of scarcity. And with the Passover, when they leave slavery and go to what becomes the Holy Land, God promises them that they'll be in a land of milk and honey, and that they have passed over from scarcity to abundance. And the idea that we have that God sets a table in the wilderness comes from that sojourn, that trip from scarcity to abundance, when the people in Israel were so afraid, well, who's going to take care of us now? We're going to be starving to death. We're out
I need
here.
some good fish.
Yeah, we need something to eat. And they didn't trust that it really was a universe of abundance. And some of them started saying, oh, let's go back. At least Pharaoh fed us. Even though Pharaoh might have taken our children and murdered them, nevertheless, we had food. And that's where the Israelites, the line actually comes from. Can God set us a table in this wilderness? And God says, damn right I can. And manna falls, and water comes from the rock. And there all of a sudden is abundance. That's the story that is being replayed on Thursday night of Holy Week before Jesus dies. It's a story about people passing over.
Nobody told me that story before.
Right.
It's a good one.
It is a good one.
I started going Thursdays.
I love Thursday night of Holy Week. It's my favorite night of that.
Good news.
Of that week. It's great news. You pass over from slavery into the freedom of a fully gifted world. And so that's what's happening around that table on Thursday night, is Jesus is saying, this is the truth. This is the Passover that you have been waiting for. Just in the same way God took your ancestors out of slavery with Pharaoh, so I'm taking you out of slavery to Caesar, and the new age, the age of freedom, the Exodus, the liberation has now opened. And so that moment, I think for the disciples, must have been so critical in their understanding of who Jesus was and who they were going to become. I think that is really the transformative night of Holy Week. So often we get hung up what happens on Good Friday on the cross. But I think that for the disciples, the real insight, the depth and power of what was going on happened the night before. It happened on Thursday.
Friendship.
Yeah, it's about friendship and not living in hierarchy. It's about being around a table and not being stuck at the bottom of a pyramid. It's about not being a slave, but being a servant. If you really understand the contrast between what was happening, if you understand the framework, first of all, of the Exodus, and then the idea that Caesar is functionally the new Pharaoh, and then you contrast everything that is happening in their political world, where these people are at the bottom of this social construct, and their lives are really held at the whim of the Roman Empire. Caesar could stop feeding all of Israel any day that Caesar wanted to. These people who had given up their day jobs to follow Jesus, and we sometimes think of that as, oh my gosh, how hard that would have been to give up your livelihood as a fisherman and just go follow Jesus. In truth be told, it was not that hard at all, because those fishermen paid 90% of whatever they made in fishing to Caesar as their gratitude for being part of the Roman Empire. And so when Jesus called them and said, hey, stop fishing, it was like Jesus was literally calling them out of the utmost poverty and a life of control, where they were being forced to tithe 90% of everything they made back to the very person who was holding them in slavery by this corrupted system of gratitude. And so I don't know about you, but as soon as Jesus walked by and said, follow me, I'd be on that trip. Right. It's like, yeah, get me out of here. There's got to be something better. And so they journey with Jesus. They listen to his stories. They see things like the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000. They see that their rabbi, Jesus, is also a person who lives Jesus lives in the reality of God's abundance.
You don't think they were like, wow, they could do this, we could get a lot of stuff too.
Sure.
We could get mansions too.
Yeah, I think that probably the disciples did at first. Yeah, they did not understand at first that they were following Jesus that would turn into a way of life that was so radical. I think when Jesus called them away from slavery and said, I'm going to do something different for you, they probably thought they were going to become the, sort of the top dogs in the Roman Empire, that the whole thing would be turned over and that they would get to be the overlords, and that meant they would become wealthy and that other people would be held in slavery underneath of them. But as it all turns out, if they were paying attention for the 3 years, Jesus was offering something entirely different. He was saying, no, we're not going to set up a new system of hierarchy with somebody on top and somebody else on the bottom. He says, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. And so, so he's, so when he says that thing about last and first, he's not saying, oh, I'm going to set up a new pyramid. He's just taking the whole thing down. He's opening their imagination to the possibility of a world where there really is no first or last. And so Jesus is constantly doing this, enlarging their imagination until that Thursday night, when it all becomes perfectly clear, where it becomes about washing one another's feet, about not who is sitting at the head of the table, but being a family around a table. It's about how bread and wine are going to sustain us on this journey of compassion, of love, of grace, of salvation. And that the line that we get that comes down to liturgical Christians in the celebration of the Lord's Supper or the Lord's Prayer, or excuse me, of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, that line, the gifts of God for the people of God. Receive this and do it in remembrance of me. And what he was saying when he did that, and what we say when we're reenacting that, is the gifts are that whole table of abundance. It's for everybody.
I matter. I don't need a mansion.
Yeah, who needs a mansion at that point? Who needs a prosperity gospel? You're sitting at a table with your friends, and you're going to be fed, and that table, throughout time, the vision is there are going to be more and more and more and more chairs pulled up to that table. And so that Thursday night is the last supper of a world of oppression and violence and control and the kind of gratitude that taxes you 90% in order to keep you in slavery. So it's the last supper of all of that. But it's also the first feast. And it's the first feast of the world that God has always dreamed of. And Good Friday becomes such a devastation for these people, not only because, of course, they are watching the murderous, violent execution of their friend, which is horrible enough, but in fact, what Rome is doing by destroying Jesus' body is destroying the table. And so Rome does not want a table of abundance where all people are fed.
Why are they afraid? Do you think relationship is more powerful than leverage?
Yes, they can't imagine the structure of ancient Rome running now on debt. I owe you a debt of gratitude. I'm obligated to you until I discharge that debt. And it's running on, of course, corrupted forms of that, quid pro quo. Tit for tat, I do this so that you must do that. It's not running on the idea of noblesse oblige and really nice benefactors, but it's running on the idea that benefactors use gifts to maintain status and power and increase their own wealth. That's the kind of gratitude that runs the Roman Empire. And of course, the people who are at the top of that system, they don't want some crazy table set in the wilderness where everybody gets fed, and where those people are so empowered that they then begin to share gifts that they don't even really seem to have, like, hey, we've only got a little bit of bread and a couple fishes here. But as soon as those people really begin to experience abundance, that's going to turn into a lot. And that
Take 'em out.
And that feast, that vision of the feast turns into a powerful political vision of a different kind of society. And that's what Jesus was doing on Holy Thursday. It was reminding us of what God really intended. And so Good Friday then takes that away. It destroys it. It devastates it. It's like, it's not just Jesus' body, as I said, dying on the cross. It's not just Jesus' body dying on the cross. It's literally Rome coming in and taking axes to that table and making sure that that table is never set. Because if that table is set, they know they're doomed. And so that's what Good Friday is. The destruction of a body and the destruction of a table. The destruction of a feast. And that's why Easter Sunday becomes so extraordinary. Is because God finally says enough. You're not going to do it. You're not getting away with it this time. There have been too many acts of violence that destroyed my table. There have been too many insane politicians who wanted to take the feast away from the people of the world. I'm not going to let it happen this time. No more Pharaoh, no more Caesar. Instead, I'm going to reset this table. And so when Jesus rises and then starts this series at the end of all of the Gospels of these appearances, where he shows up again with his friends, almost every one of those appearances happens around a table. Jesus is recognized by his friends after they've been walking down a road to Emmaus. They've been having a great talk. They sit at a table, and when he breaks bread, they say, "Oh, it's Jesus." Jesus shows up at a table where the disciples have gone to the same room where they held the Last Supper, and he breathes a grace on them. He actually gifts them with a gratitude blessing at that table. Peace. It's a prayer. Peace. And all of a sudden the world turns upside down for them. Jesus feeds the disciples on a beach, fish. You look at those accounts, there's, depending on how you count, there's somewhere between 10 and 15 of them. And the vast majority of them happen around a meal. And if that doesn't make the point, Jesus does not come back and say, he doesn't come back and go to Calvary and say, hey, look at the cross. Look at that violent instrument of death that Caesar tried to use to stop all this.
I don't have anything to do with that.
Yeah, Jesus does not point to the cross. Jesus points to the table.
I don't have anything to do with death about the table.
That's right. Yeah, the instruments of death, the instruments of empire, cross, gone. That's what the point of Easter is. We should not wear crosses around our neck. We should be wearing circles that represent tables, because that's the point.